The ground has thawed after a long Ukrainian winter. Russian forces prepare for their spring offensive. As Russian troops begin to launch another wave of attacks, the ground begins to shake. Battalions of Leopard 2 tanks crest the hills in front of them. M1 Abrams circle around their flanks. The tanks from NATO have finally arrived, and they're about to push Russian forces out of Ukraine once and for all. This might be the reality Russia faces in the coming months, almost a year after Putin invaded Ukraine and started a war that cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. NATO has decided to finally send Western tanks to Ukraine. Since the beginning of the war, President Zelensky has been asking for missiles, supplies, and tanks. The West has been hesitant to send certain weapons for fear it could cause Vladimir Putin to escalate his tactics by using nuclear weapons. However, that fear seems to be dissipating. As the first month of 2023 came to an end, the United States made a big announcement. Biden told the world that the U.S. would be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine to help the country take back and defend its territory. This has prompted Germany and other nations to step up to the plate and send Ukraine tanks of their own. The question now is, what will Ukraine do once they get the tanks? But before we can answer this, we need to know what type and how many tanks will be sent. 31 M1 Abrams tanks is not a lot. If these were the only vehicles sent to Ukraine, they would have very little impact on the war. Yes, the M1 Abrams is the most sophisticated and deadly tank in the world, but Ukraine is a massive country and a single battalion wouldn't be able to protect all of its lands. There's a couple of reasons why the US is sending 31 Abrams. Firstly, this is how many tanks are in a single Ukrainian tank battalion, which is composed of 3 companies of 10 and 1 tank for the battalion commander. However, the actual reason that the United States decided to send tanks at all was to force other NATO nations to send tanks of their own to aid in the war effort. In particular, the United States hoped to sway Germany into sending its Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. Germany has been hesitant to commit to such a bold move, with Russia being right at their doorstep. To be fair, the United States is an ocean away from the fighting, which means there's quite a large buffer between them and Russia. Germany probably has a slightly different mindset since they're sharing a continent with the aggressor. Either way, the commitment by the United States worked, and Germany announced they would be sending Leopard 2s to Ukraine as well. This had a cascading effect, with Britain, Poland, Portugal, Norway, Spain, Finland, and the Netherlands all pledging to send their own tanks in the future. It's unclear how many vehicles each country will commit to the cause, but best estimates put Germany initially sending 14 Leopard 2s, with talks of eventually supplementing them with 2 German battalions, which would number around 80 tanks in total. This would be a game changer for Ukraine, but as of right now, it's not entirely clear when these tanks will be delivered. Along with the 31 planned Abrams and 14 Leopard 2 tanks, Britain said it'll also send 14 Challenger 2s. Even with NATO nations supplying Ukraine with dozens of tanks, it might still not be enough. President Zelensky has said that Ukraine will need around 300 tanks to carry out the missions needed to push Russia out of the country. NATO is still a long way from providing that many tanks, but every little bit helps as long as the vehicles make it to Ukraine in time. It's estimated that the Leopard 2s will reach Ukraine in the next 2 to 3 months. That would put the delivery date around April. This will be when spring is in full swing and the weather becomes warmer. It's also around this time that Russia will likely launch its next offensive. Therefore, tank deliveries need to happen sooner than later. However, it's not that simple. The tanks can't just be dropped off and driven onto the battlefield. Even after delivery, there will be months of training, mechanical checks, and logistic reviews before the tanks can be moved to the front lines. The great thing about the Leopard 2s is they run on diesel and have a pretty straightforward firing system. This means the training that needs to be done will not include overly complicated computer systems. The Leopard 2s are also going to be easier to repair than some of the other tanks being sent to Ukraine. The M1 Abrams, on the other hand, is a whole other beast. It's estimated that the training to effectively use and maneuver an M1 Abrams could take months. On top of that, the US tank requires jet fuel to run its engine. The Abrams might be the most sophisticated tank ever built, which is great if the team operating it is well trained, but this is not a vehicle anyone can just hop into and drive around. What this means is that it will likely be 6 to 8 months before any M1 Abrams will be operational on the battlefields of Ukraine. But Ukraine might not have that long. When the United States and Germany announced they were sending tanks to Ukraine, Russia immediately launched a new round of bombardment across the country. 55 missiles were fired from jets, ships, and drones, which ended up killing 2 civilians and destroying a number of buildings, most of which had no military value. Ukraine says it intercepted 47 of the missiles fired, but the senseless loss of civilian life is just another clear indication that Putin does not care who dies. He just wants to cause mayhem to keep the West from providing further aid to Ukraine. These types of attacks will continue as long as the war does, which is why the tanks being delivered to Ukraine can't come soon enough. So once the tanks arrive, what will happen? Well, even before the vehicles are sent, Ukrainian soldiers are already being trained on how to use the vehicles. This is crucial so that when they get there, Ukrainian forces can immediately drive them into battle. The key components of the training missions are to ensure that tank operators understand the logistics capabilities, maintenance procedures, and operational limitations of these tanks. Nothing would be worse than a team having to abandon their vehicle because they pushed it too hard or didn't know how to fix a malfunction. This shouldn't be a problem, as throughout the war, the Ukrainian soldiers have shown just how industrious they can be. They fixed broken-down Russian tanks and used them to launch their own offensives against the enemy. Russia has made countless mistakes with its own tanks. They have not trained their teams properly, which has led to vehicles being driven off bridges, becoming stuck in ditches, even running out of fuel in the middle of a battle. Ukrainian forces are happy to find abandoned Russian tanks that they can often repurpose or strip for parts. The new tanks being delivered by NATO will be slightly different than the abandoned Cold War-era tanks of the Russians. For one thing, the Leopard 2s and the M1 Abrams are much newer and more capable than the tanks Russia's using. This is great news for Ukraine, but it also means they need to buckle down and take the training seriously to ensure they can optimize the effectiveness of the tanks being delivered. Since the Leopard 2s will arrive first, this is where Ukrainian training has begun. These vehicles will serve as a good starting point to provide Ukrainian soldiers with a foundation on how to use the M1 Abrams when they're delivered. But as we mentioned before, this is a race against time. The new tanks need to be deployed before the Russian spring offensive begins. With each day that passes without Ukraine receiving tanks, Russia is moving more and more men and vehicles to the front line. It's not a question of if Russia will launch another attack, but when. So Ukraine needs to make sure its defenses are solid and that it can stop the onslaught of Russian soldiers and vehicles that will inevitably cross the front lines to regain the territory that they lost after the initial invasion. Yet, there is something about the tanks that no one can deny. They are offensive weapons. You probably heard the saying, the best offense is a good defense. Well, the reverse is true as well. In Ukraine, the best defense is a good offense. The tanks being sent to Ukraine will likely be used to launch a new Ukrainian offensive. This is why it's important that they reach the front lines in the next month or two. Even without advanced Western tanks, Ukraine has managed to reclaim huge amounts of land from Russia, and every indication suggests that when the brutal winter ends, Ukraine might be capable of pushing into the Kherson Oblast and pushing all the way to Crimea. But what if they had Leopard 2 and M1 Abrams tanks to lead the charge? Even with the relatively small number of tanks being sent to Ukraine, the modern Western vehicles would decimate the clunky Cold War Russian tanks that Putin's forces are now heavily relying on. The Leopard 2s and Abrams have more firepower, thicker armor, and increased maneuverability when compared to most Russian tanks. And even though tanks are offensive weapons, Ukraine will not be using them to launch attacks into Russia itself. Instead, they'll be employed to take back territory that is rightfully theirs and drive Russian forces out of Ukraine. Therefore, even though the tanks will be used in an offensive manner, really the strategy is to mount an aggressive defense to protect their country from an enemy invasion. The Western tanks will also likely be used in thunder runs, which were incredibly successful during the Ukrainian offensive that took back territory in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions of the country. This is one of the reasons Ukraine was able to push all the way to the Dnipro River and reclaim everything except that southeastern part of the nation. Thunder runs are fast-paced attacks that use brute force to plow through enemy defenses and encircle them or force a retreat. Tanks are the backbone of thunder runs as they have heavy armor and can move quickly through an enemy position. Ukraine used older tanks and vehicles to accomplish this tactic several months ago, so having much more powerful and maneuverable tanks such as the Leopards and Abrams will be devastating to the Russian defensive lines. The Russians have dug trenches and built fortifications in the Kherson Oblast, but like many of the decisions they've made during this war, what they're doing in southern Ukraine doesn't seem very planned out. The trenches aren't long enough and don't provide the ability to fall back deeper into defensive positions. This means that they'll not be an effective countermeasure to stop tanks and armored vehicles from passing through the region. Basically, every tactic Russia is using in southern Ukraine to hold the region is outdated and poorly executed. This is good news for Ukrainian forces, especially if they have NATO tanks that can either drive around or plow through any tank traps that Russia has set up. Ukraine will likely wait until the Western tanks arrive to push into the Kherson Oblast via the left bank using thunder runs. This initial push will be led by the heavily armored Leopards and Abrams, followed by lighter vehicles and troops. The Russian defenses will quickly fall, allowing Ukrainian forces to secure the left bank. At the same time, older tanks and captured Russian vehicles might speed across the east bank, where Russian forces are few and far between. The Ukrainians will stay off the main roads where Russia has concentrated most of its defenses and cruise along the open landscape. This force can then circle around behind the Russian forces and block their retreat. Russians will make a mad dash to cross into Crimea, where they'll try to mount another defense. If this happens, the war will be pretty much over. The West might send more tanks to expedite the process, but eventually Ukrainian forces would cross into Crimea, and at that point Putin would be in big trouble. There would be no way for him to spin this defeat into a positive or weasel his way out of a confrontation with the Russian people. So Ukraine is probably planning to be aggressive once the tanks are delivered, but again, it's all still a matter of timing. If Leopards and Abrams reach them in the next month or two, they can launch their own offensive when spring begins. If Western nations continue to drag their feet, Ukraine might have to hold back a Russian advance, and when the tanks finally do arrive, they can be used in a counteroffensive. Being able to attack first with state-of-the-art tanks is definitely the better option, but as the Ukrainian people have shown the world throughout this conflict, they will adapt and do what they have to protect their country. It's important to note that as the United States, Germany, and other NATO nations prepare to send tanks, the Russian military is regrouping. They will continue to fire missiles and send kamikaze drones to strike key infrastructure within Ukraine, but they're also amassing more soldiers in southern Ukraine. Until Ukrainian forces can force them out of their territory and Putin is removed from power, civilians will continue to die, and the war will rage on. This is why Ukraine desperately needs the tanks as soon as possible. All Russia is trying to do right now is bide more time so they can increase their numbers and supplies. This is a very common tactic for Russia. The nation is so large and has so many natural resources that they tend to wait out their enemy till they've amassed an overwhelming number of troops and can throw them into battle. There are weapons and men traveling across the vast lands of Russia at this very moment. Conscripts, workers, and forced laborers are building more weapons. Russia is still selling oil and natural gas to countries from around the world to bring in more money. With these funds, they're buying kamikaze drones from Iran and missiles from whoever will sell them to them. Ukraine needs the Western tanks to launch an offensive that will decimate Russian forces and push Putin into admitting defeat. However, the longer it takes for this to happen, the stronger the Russian forces will become. As of right now, Russia has no response to the M1 Abrams, and the Leopard 2s are more than capable of dealing with any armor that Russia has in Ukraine. Then again, maybe Ukraine won't even wait for the tanks to be delivered. They have been pushing Russia back ever since the shock of the initial invasion, without much help from NATO or the West. There's little reason to believe that they couldn't continue to do so with the same tactics and techniques they've been using up to now. The problem is that the longer the conflict is drawn out and the more desperate Putin gets, the more people will die. Tanks from the West will only speed up the Ukrainian advance and could actually end up saving lives in the long run. But the tanks being sent to Ukraine aren't just for the Ukrainians. It's also a way for NATO to show they are no longer afraid of Russia's threats of escalation. We all know Putin likes to bring up his nuclear arsenal to show that he's a big man with big guns. And if anyone is crazy enough to use nuclear weapons, it's probably Putin. But NATO has apparently had enough of his antics. Initially, weapons such as tanks and surface-to-air missiles were being stockpiled by nations around the world in case they needed to protect themselves from Russia. This no longer seems to be the case. By sending tanks and other important weapons to Ukraine, Western nations are saying they no longer fear Russia will try to win the war and then invade more of Europe. At the very least, sending tanks to Ukraine shows that countries like the US, Germany, and Britain believe they can fend off a Russian attack with the weapons they already have. Putin has continually told NATO not to cross several lines, but like his forces in Ukraine, these lines are continually being pushed back. It's now clear that Putin and Russia are not nearly as strong as they were once believed to be. At the start of the conflict, Russia truly thought it would roll into Ukraine and easily take over the government in the country. Ukraine's resources and people would then have to be incorporated into Putin's new Russian empire, and a real threat to the rest of the world would be standing on Europe's doorstep. And Putin wasn't the only one who believed this. In 2014, NATO did nothing as Putin stole Crimea from Ukraine. It was very clear at the time that the West was afraid of Russia's nuclear capability and the power it held. However, now that Ukraine has shown NATO and the rest of the world Russia isn't nearly as strong as they were believed to be, Western countries are finally willing to stand up to Putin. They have disregarded Putin's threats by agreeing to send tanks to Ukraine. The vehicles still need to make it to Ukraine and be deployed to the front lines, but the message is clear. NATO believes Ukraine can win this war. The West is no longer afraid of Putin or his military, and the nations of Europe feel they have the ability to fend off any attack that Russia might launch now or in the future. For the nations of NATO, these tanks are symbolic, but for Ukraine, they will be used to launch an offensive against Russia and push them out of their country. Now watch why Russia is running out of tanks, war in Ukraine, or check out what if Ukraine wins the war.